Hello there, and welcome to Midnight Geography. Tonight, we'll drift into the quiet corners of Maine's remarkable landscape. Maine is where the continent whispers its oldest stories through granite and tide, a place where North America meets the sea in 10,000 different ways. It's a geography written in islands and inlets, in mountains worn smooth by time, in lakes that hold the sky. If you enjoy these peaceful geographical explorations, consider liking and subscribing. It helps other curious minds find their way here too. But for now, let's begin. Mount Desert Island holds a secret that most visitors to Acadia never discover. There, cutting nearly through the heart of the island, lies some Sound, the only true fjord on the entire eastern seaboard of the United States. Carved by glaciers some 13,000 years ago, this narrow arm of the sea reaches depths of 175 feet, its walls rising steeply from waters that remember ice. The Sound divides the island almost in half, creating two distinct worlds connected only by thin bridges of land. In the early morning, when fog fills this ancient glacial groove, you might forget you're in Maine entirely. The water here moves differently than in the open ocean, trapped and circulating in patterns that haven't changed since the ice retreated. Local fishermen say the Sound has moods, sometimes mirror still, reflecting the mountains that cradle it. Other times, churning with currents that seem to come from nowhere. It's a place where you can stand on shores that were carved by ice a mile thick, where the earth still bears the scratches and scars of that frozen sculptor's tools. Just 14 miles northeast of Mount Desert Island, across the waters of Frenchman Bay, the Schoodic Peninsula extends into the Atlantic like a forgotten finger of land. Though it belongs to Acadia National Park, the only section on the mainland, it receives less than half the visitors of its famous island neighbor. Here, the granite meets the sea in a different conversation, one conducted without crowds. The peninsula offers something rare in our modern world: solitude within a national park. The same geological forces that created the drama of Mount Desert Island worked here too, but the results feel more intimate, more personal. The rocks here are older, darker, speaking of volcanic fires that burned before life crawled from the seas. On winter days, when storms drive waves against these shores, you can have 6 miles of coastline entirely to yourself, watching the Atlantic perform its ancient work of turning stone to sand, grain by patient grain. Maine possesses more islands than days in a decade, 4,613 chunks of land larger than an acre, scattered like thoughts across the Gulf of Maine. Yet of all these fragments of earth surrounded by water, only 15 maintain what we might call true communities. Places with year-round residents, schools where children learn arithmetic while watching lobster boats pass their windows, post offices where mail arrives by boat when weather permits. These 15 islands are like small planets, each with its own gravity, its own way of bending time. The other 4,598 islands sleep mostly empty, visited by seabirds and seals, by summer sailors and solitary kayakers. Some have names that tell stories: burnt coat, mistake, hypocrite. Others remain nameless, known only by coordinates, existing perfectly without human witness. Together they form an archipelago of solitude, a scattered geography where land and sea have never quite decided where one ends and the other begins. Monhegan Island rises from the sea 12 miles from the nearest mainland shore, a dome of rock 160 feet high that creates its own weather. The island stands far enough from land to intercept weather systems first, to catch clouds and deflect winds in ways that make its climate a full 10 degrees different from the coast it faces. Artists have been coming here for more than a century, drawn by light that seems to belong to another latitude entirely. The island is barely a square mile, yet it contains worlds, dark spruce forests that have never been cut, meadows where wildflowers bloom weeks earlier than on the mainland, cliffs where the full force of the open Atlantic announces itself with every wave. In winter, when the summer visitors have fled and the artist studios stand empty, fewer than 70 people remain, making it one of the most isolated communities on the eastern seaboard. They say you can tell a Monhegan winter resident by their eyes. They've seen storms that would terrify mainlanders, watched seas build to heights that erase the horizon. In the far north of Maine, where few roads penetrate and even fewer people venture, the Allagash Wilderness Waterway threads through 92 miles of forest without a single road crossing its path. This is the longest protected river corridor east of the Mississippi, a ribbon of water that flows through a landscape that looks much as it did before European feet touched North American soil. The Allagash moves through lakes and rapids, through dead waters where moose feed in the shallows, and stretches where the current barely whispers. Paddlers who traverse its full length often speak of how the river changes them, how after a week without seeing a road or building, time begins to flow differently. The river knows things. It remembers log drives when entire forests floated toward mills, remembers indigenous peoples who traveled its length for thousands of years before that. Eagles nest in pines along its banks, and at night, the only lights are stars reflected in black water, doubled and trembling with each ripple. Beneath the busy streets of Portland, underneath coffee shops and bookstores and restaurants where tourists gather, lies a hidden city, a network of tunnels built in the 1860s. Originally constructed to move goods from the waterfront without clogging the streets above, these passages extend under 30 city blocks, mostly sealed now, mostly forgotten. But they're still there. These stone corridors where merchants once wheeled barrels of molasses and rum, where the city's commercial blood once flowed unseen. Some sections have been bricked up for a century, others flood with high tides, still connected to the sea that gave the city its purpose. Urban explorers who've managed to access these tunnels describe a geography of darkness, where compass directions mean nothing, and the city above might as well be on another planet. Water drips through stones laid by hands dead for generations, and sometimes, they say, you can hear the city above. Footsteps, music, laughter, muffled and strange, as if from another dimension of the same space. Where Maine meets the Bay of Fundy near the town of Cutler, the land doesn't ease into the sea, it falls. The bold coast presents cliffs that drop 150 feet straight into waters that know the world's highest tides. These are the highest rocky headlands on the entire Atlantic seaboard, a wall of stone that seems to have been cleaved by some giant's axe. The rocks here are dark, almost black when wet, composed of volcanic basalt that cooled when this land was somewhere else entirely, somewhere near the equator in another age. Walking the trail along these cliffs on a foggy day is like walking at the edge of existence itself. One side solid earth, the other side nothing but gray void and the sound of invisible waves far below. The trees here grow sideways, shaped by winds that never stop, and the grass is tough, salt-adapted, more like wire than vegetation. It's a place that makes you understand why sailors once called this the graveyard coast, why ship's captains would add days to their journey to avoid these waters. In western Maine spreads a lake with a name that takes longer to say than to paddle across, Moose Lukmaguntik. Despite its 16 letters, it's only the fourth largest lake in Maine, covering 16,300 acres in a shape that resembles a spider, with arms reaching in 5 cardinal directions. The name comes from the Abenaki, meaning moose feeding place. And even today, in the early morning, you can watch moose wade through the shallows, feeding on aquatic plants with water streaming from their massive heads when they surface. The lake fills a basin carved by glaciers, its bottom littered with boulders the size of houses, dropped by melting ice like a giant's game of marbles. In certain lights, usually late afternoon when the sun angles low, the water turns the color of tea, tinted by tannins from the surrounding forests. The lake has moods, sometimes mirror calm, sometimes whipped into whitecaps by winds funneling down the valleys. Locals know every bay and inlet by names that don't appear on maps, names that describe what happens there, where eagles nest, where the big trout hide, where the ice goes out first in spring. Near the coast in Freeport, just minutes from outlets where tourists buy outdoor gear, lies Maine's most unexpected landscape, a 40-acre desert. The desert of Maine isn't ancient. It's not the product of millions of years of geological processes. Instead, it emerged in the 1800s when poor farming practices stripped away topsoil, exposing glacial silt deposits laid down 10,000 years ago. What started as a small patch of sand has grown, swallowing buildings, consuming pastures, creating a miniature Sahara in a land known for forests and fog. The sand here is different from beach sand, finer, almost like powder, composed of glacial flour ground by ice from granite mountains. Walking through it feels wrong somehow, as if you've stepped through a portal to somewhere that shouldn't exist in Maine. Trees at the edges stand half buried, their trunks disappearing into dunes that shift with each storm. It's a reminder that deserts aren't always about absence of water. Sometimes they're about what happens when we ask too much from the land, when we forget that soil is not infinite. On Mount Desert Island, Cadillac Mountain rises 1,530 feet above the Atlantic, modest by mountain standards, but perfectly positioned by geography. From October 7th through March 6th, its summit receives the first light of day in the entire United States. Standing there in the pre-dawn darkness, waiting for sunrise, you become the first person in the country to see tomorrow. The mountain is pink granite, formed deep underground when North America was assembling itself, raised and exposed by forces that took millions of years to unfold. The summit is bare rock, scoured by ice and wind, with patches of low plants that grip cracks in the stone. On clear mornings, you can see 60 miles of coastline, 100 islands, the mountains of western Maine like blue ghosts on the horizon. But it's those moments just before sunrise that feel most profound, when the eastern sky begins to lighten while stars still shine overhead, when you can feel the earth turning toward its star, when geography becomes astronomy. Between the small town of Monson and the base of Mount Katahdin stretches the 100-mile wilderness, the longest section of the Appalachian Trail without a single town, road, or resupply point. For 100 miles, the trail threads through forests that have forgotten human permanence, crossing streams without bridges, climbing mountains without names. Hikers who enter this section carry everything they need for 7 to 10 days, becoming temporarily nomadic in a way that modern life rarely allows. The wilderness here isn't pristine. It was logged heavily a century ago. But it has healed, the forest recovering its dignity. Moose are common, bears are seen daily, and the silence at night is so complete, it has weight, The trail passes ponds where loons call it sunset, climbs ridges where you can see nothing but forest to every horizon, descends into valleys where streams have never been dammed or diverted. It's a geography of absence of roads, of cell towers, of the constant human chatter that fills most landscapes. In Frenchman Bay, between Mount Desert Island and the Scudic Peninsula, lie the Porcupine Islands, named by Samuel de Champlain in 1604, when their evergreen trees looked like quills on a porcupine's back from his ship. The islands, burnt porcupine, sheep porcupine, long porcupine, bald porcupine, sit like stepping stones that forgot their purpose, each with its own character. At low tide, some nearly connect, revealing gravel bars where seals rest. At high tide, they become true islands again, separated by channels where the current runs strong. The trees that gave them their names still stand, though centuries of storms have shaped them into forms that seem more sculptural than botanical. From the mainland, especially in morning fog, the islands appear and disappear like thoughts, sometimes clear and distinct, sometimes merged into one gray mass, sometimes invisible entirely. They're privately owned mostly, visited mainly by kayakers who paddle their perimeters, temporary visitors to a geography that predates names, that will outlast the language we use to describe it. Deep beneath Mount Katahdin and much of northern Maine lies bedrock 400 million years old, formed when this land sat near the equator. Continental drift, that slow dance of the Earth's crust, has carried Maine from tropical latitudes to its current northern position, a journey of thousands of miles, taking hundreds of millions of years. The rocks remember their origins. You can find fossils of tropical sea creatures in mountain slate, evidence of coral reefs in limestone deposits. This ancient basement rock, this foundation of Maine, tells a story of movement so slow it makes glaciers seem hasty. When you stand on these old stones, you're standing on traveled ground, earth that has crossed oceans, passed through different climates, been buried and exposed multiple times. The granite peaks that seem so permanent are actually newcomers, forced up through this older rock like slow-motion fountains of molten stone. Understanding this history changes how you see the landscape. Every mountain becomes a monument to patience, every valley a testament to time's persistence. Far from any public road, Eagle Lake spreads across 5,500 acres of North Maine woods, accessible only by private logging roads or floatplane. The lake exists in a kind of voluntary isolation, surrounded by working forest where trees are harvested on 100-year cycles. To reach it by land requires permission, keys to locked gates, knowledge of unmarked turns on roads that appear on no public map. Those who make the journey find a lake that seems forgotten by the modern world, where loons outnumber boats, where the only buildings are a few fishing camps used a few weeks each year. The lake is deep enough that it never fully freezes, even in winters when temperatures drop to 40 below. Its water is so clear, you can see bottom at 20 feet, watch fish swimming in schools like clouds of thought. At night, with no lights for 50 miles in any direction, the Milky Way reflects in the water so clearly that kayakers say it feels like paddling through space. The Presumpscot River falls 270 feet in its 27-mile journey from Sebago Lake to Casco Bay, a gradient that once powered the American Industrial Revolution in miniature. 30 mills once lined its banks, using the river's faithful flow to saw lumber, grind grain, weave fabric, and manufacture the materials of 19th century life. Today, most of the mills are gone, their foundations hidden under shopping centers, or slowly being reclaimed by forest. But the river remembers. In its pools below old dam sites, you can still find pieces of machinery, gears, and bolts that worked for decades before the river claimed them. The Presumpscot carries the second largest volume of water of any river in southern Maine, yet most people cross it without knowing its name. It's a working river that never stopped working, just changed jobs, from powering mills to providing drinking water, from floating logs to floating canoes. In spring, when snowmelt swells its flow, you can hear it from a quarter-mile away, a sound like distant thunder that never stops. Aroostook County spreads across the top of Maine like a crown, larger than Connecticut and Rhode Island combined, 6,800 square miles, with only 67,000 people scattered across its vastness. This is a geography of distances, where your nearest neighbor might be miles away, where you can drive for an hour without seeing another car. The county is larger than several European nations, but has fewer people than a small city. The land here rolls in gentle waves, potato fields that stretch to horizons, forests that seem to have no end, rivers that wind through valleys where no one lives. In winter, the county becomes even larger somehow, when snow makes roads impassable and each farm becomes an island. The night sky here is so dark that the aurora borealis is visible several times each winter, green curtains of light dancing over a landscape that seems to belong more to Canada than the United States. It's a place where geography enforces solitude, where the land is so vast that humans remain visitors no matter how long they stay. Beneath the surface of the Gulf of Maine lies a feature more dramatic than anything visible above water, the Northeast Channel, a submarine valley deeper than the Grand Canyon. This underwater gorge cuts through the ocean floor, connecting the shallow continental shelf with the true deep ocean. The channel funnels cold, nutrient-rich water from the deep Atlantic into the Gulf, creating upwellings that support one of the most productive fishing grounds on Earth. The Gulf itself covers 36,000 square miles, larger than Lake Superior, but most people think of it as simply ocean, not recognizing it as a distinct geographical feature with its own circulation patterns, its own ecology, its own moods. The bottom topography reads like a drowned mountain range, underwater peaks called banks, where cod and haddock gather, deep basins where mud has accumulated for millennia, channels and ledges that funnel currents in predictable patterns. Whales follow these invisible highways, knowing the underwater geography better than we know the roads above. Rising from Moosehead Lake like a granite fist, Mount Kineo presents a 700-foot cliff of rhyolite, a volcanic rock found nowhere else in New England. The mountain is a geological anomaly, a chunk of volcanic rock that cooled underground and was exposed by erosion, surrounded by completely different stone. Indigenous peoples traveled hundreds of miles to gather Kineo flint, the fracture pattern perfect for making tools and weapons. You can still find flakes of it at archaeological sites throughout the Northeast, evidence of trade networks that followed rivers and ridgelines for thousands of years. The mountain rises so steeply from the lake that from certain angles it appears to be falling forward, about to topple into the water. Peregrine falcons nest on its cliffs, using the updrafts created when wind hits the vertical rock face. From the summit, you can see most of Moosehead Lake's 400 miles of shoreline, a view that hasn't changed substantially since the Ice Age ended. The mountain stands like a sentinel, watching over waters that freeze 3 feet thick in winter, that in summer reflect clouds so perfectly the mountain seems to float. Bailey Island connects to Orr's Island through a unique feat of engineering. A cribstone bridge built in 1928 the only one of its kind remaining in the world. The bridge is made of granite blocks, stacked without mortar in a honeycomb pattern that allows tides to flow freely through, reducing pressure from storm waves that would destroy a solid structure. Walking across it at high tide, you can look down through the gaps between stones and see water rushing below. Feel the bridge vibrate slightly with the force of the current. The design came from Scotland originally, but this is the last example still standing. A piece of working geometry that solves the problem of connecting islands without blocking the sea's movement. Each granite block weighs over a ton, cut and placed by hand, fitted so precisely that after nearly a century of storms, ice, and tides, the bridge remains stable. Engineers who study it marvel at its simplicity. No concrete, no steel, just stone arranged in a pattern that turns the ocean's force into structural stability. At sunset, when light filters through the gaps between stones, the bridge seems less like infrastructure and more like sculpture, a collaboration between human ingenuity and geological patience. The St. John River flows north. In a continent where rivers overwhelmingly flow south or east or west, the St. John insists on flowing north for much of its length, draining the northern Maine wilderness toward New Brunswick. For 118 miles, it forms the international border, a boundary marked not by fences, but by flowing water that freezes solid enough in winter to drive trucks across. The river has a peculiar habit of flooding backwards. Ice jams in its lower reaches can cause water to reverse flow, flooding valleys that normally drain into it. This northern flow creates unique ecosystems, carrying seeds and nutrients in directions that defy the usual patterns. The Maliseet people called it Wolastoq, the Good River, and used it as a highway for thousands of years before European maps tried to contain it with borders. In spring, the river can rise 20 feet in 24 hours, reminding anyone who's forgotten that rivers are not permanent things, but processes, always changing, always insisting on their own geography. Baxter State Park sprawls across 200,000 acres of northern Maine, but allows only 1,000 visitors to enter its boundaries each day. This is wilderness by design, solitude enforced by mathematics. The park's former governor who donated the land insisted it remain forever wild, and his vision holds. No paved roads penetrate beyond the gatehouse, cell phones are prohibited, and the night sky remains unmarred by a single electric light. Rangers turn people away once the daily limit is reached. No exceptions, no reservations. Weeks in advance can guarantee entry if you're the 1,001st car. This forced scarcity creates something rare, a landscape where humans remain guests rather than inhabitants. In autumn, when maples and birches turn the mountains into flames of color, those 1,000 daily visitors spread across an area larger than Rhode Island, often hiking all day without seeing another person. The park doesn't just preserve land. It preserves an experience of land that's almost extinct elsewhere in the eastern United States. Mountains here have Abenaki names that twist the tongue: Wasataquoik, Nessawadnahunk, names that remind us these peaks had meaning long before they had elevation markers. In central Maine, the Belgrade Lakes form a chain of 7 connected lakes, water flowing from one to the next through streams that barely deserve the name, passages sometimes narrow enough to jump across. Together, they create 20,000 acres of water surface, all eventually funneling through a single outlet at Wings Mills Dam. Each lake has its own personality. Great Pond sprawls wide and shallow. Long Pond lives up to its name, stretching narrow for miles. Messalonsky means white clay in Abenaki for the pale marl deposits on its bottom. The lakes remember the glaciers that carved them, their bottoms littered with erratics, boulders carried from mountains hundreds of miles north. In summer, the water warms in layers that don't mix, creating thermoclines where cold and warm water meet in invisible walls that fish gather against. Morning mist rises from these lakes in columns, each lake producing its own weather, its own microclimate where frost comes earlier or later than the land around it. The connecting streams reverse direction with wind and rain, sometimes flowing north, sometimes south, as if the lakes breathe together. At Quoddy Head near Lubeck, America ends. This is the easternmost point of the United States, where the sun rises 27 minutes earlier than in Boston, though they share the same time zone. The lighthouse here, candy-striped in red and white, watches over waters where the Bay of Fundy meets the Gulf of Maine, where tides can differ by 20 feet twice daily. Standing at this eastern edge in darkness, waiting for dawn, you become the first person in America to see the new day. The rocks here are ancient, twisted into patterns that speak of pressures and heat from when continents collided. On foggy days, which is most days, the foghorn sounds every 15 seconds, a rhythm that becomes hypnotic, like a giant's breathing. Whales pass close to shore here, following currents that surge past the point. The surrounding bog lands grow plants that belong further north, Arctic species that found refuge here when the ice retreated and never left. It's a geography of edges, where the familiar continent gives way to something else, where you can feel the Earth's curve in the way the horizon bends. Maine contains 32,000 miles of rivers and streams, enough flowing water to wrap around the Earth's equator with thousands of miles to spare. These waters form a circulatory system, carrying snowmelt from mountains to sea, creating corridors through forests where moose and deer travel, where brook trout hide in pools so dark they look like holes in the earth. Every stream knows its way to the ocean, even the smallest trickle that appears only in spring. Even the underground streams that flow through gravel, unseen but not unfelt by the trees whose roots find them. Some of these streams have names passed down through generations: Pokey Moonshine Brook, Pollywog Stream, Misery Stream. Others remain nameless, known only by the animals that drink from them. Together they drain a landscape that receives 40 inches of rain yearly, organizing that water, giving it purpose and direction. In winter, many of these streams disappear under ice and snow, flowing in darkness for months, patient rivers waiting for spring. Thunderhole in Acadia creates sound from silence, roars from calm seas. This narrow inlet in the granite coast has a cave at its end, partially submerged, where waves compress air into a chamber that releases with explosive force. When conditions align, the right tide height, the right wave size, the right wind direction, the sound can reach 110 decibels, loud enough to hear 2 miles away, a geological thunderclap that seems to come from the earth itself. The whole only thunders perhaps 20 days a year when everything aligns perfectly. Other days it merely sighs or gurgles or remains silent while tourists wait disappointedly. But when it works, when the ocean and the rock collaborate, the sound is primordial, like the earth clearing its throat. The spray can shoot 40 feet high, carrying salt mist that coats the surrounding rocks and plants, creating a microenvironment where only the most salt-tolerant species survive. It's a reminder that the coast is not a line, but a zone of conflict, where earth and water negotiate their ancient boundary with violence and beauty in equal measure. The Androscoggin River can't make up its mind which way to flow. 4 times along its course, it reverses direction, flowing north, then south, then east, then west, following ancient fault lines in the bedrock that create a path like a signature scrawled by a wandering hand. This confusion comes from geological history. The river predates the mountains it winds through, cutting down through rising rock like a saw blade, maintaining its course while the earth lifted around it. The reversals create slack water zones where sediment settles, building fertile intervals that attracted settlers, then mills, then cities. Berlin, Lewiston, Brunswick, each sits at one of these directional changes where the river pauses, considering its options. The Abenaki called it Amuskongun, fishing place for alewives, knowing that the river's confusion concentrated fish in its eddies and pools. Modern kayakers find the river disorienting. The sun appears on the wrong side. Mountains that should be north appear south. The mental map constantly needs adjusting. 25 miles from the nearest mainland shore, Matinicus Rock emerges from the Atlantic like a thought that won't go away. This is the most remote inhabited island on the east coast, though inhabited is generous. Winter populations sometimes drop to single digits, 5 or 6 people holding out against storms that can isolate the rock for weeks. The island is really just exposed bedrock, 40 acres of granite and grass where even trees give up, unable to root in the constant salt wind. Puffins nest here in summer, their only breeding colony in the United States for many years, drawn by the isolation and the fish-rich waters. Supply boats come when weather permits, which in winter might mean monthly or less. Residents have learned to predict weather by the color of the water, the behavior of gulls, the way the air feels 3 days before a storm. At night, with no lights on the mainland visible, the darkness is complete except for stars and the lighthouse beam sweeping its circle, a geography defined by what's absent rather than present. Sebago Lake plunges 316 feet deep, so deep that its bottom waters remain at 39 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, so pure that Portland pipes it directly to 200,000 people without filtration. The lake is really 2 lakes, an upper warm layer that supports swimmers and boaters, and a lower cold layer that hasn't seen sunlight in decades, maybe centuries. These layers meet at a thermocline that shifts with seasons, rising and falling like an invisible tide. The lake's purity comes from its depth and its watershed, protected forest land where rain filters through soil and bedrock before reaching the lake. In certain lights, usually late autumn when the sun angles low, the water turns black as space, and looking into it feels like looking into geological time. The lake holds landlocked salmon that never see the ocean, completing their entire life cycle in fresh water, an evolutionary decision made when the last ice age ended and their route to the sea was cut off. They've been waiting 12,000 years, growing smaller and sleeker, becoming something new. The knife edge on Mount Katahdin stretches for just over a mile with drops of 1,500 feet on either side, narrowing in places to just 3 feet wide. This is Maine's most dramatic ridgeline, a granite blade that connects Baxter Peak to Pomola Peak, worn sharp by ice and wind. Walking it requires perfect weather. Clouds can roll in within minutes, reducing visibility to 0. Wind can gust suddenly enough to knock a person off balance. The rocks here are pinkish granite, colored by feldspar, polished smooth by millions of footsteps, yet still sharp enough to cut unwary hands. From the knife edge, you can see the curvature of the earth, the way the horizon bends slightly at the edges of vision. Hawks and eagles ride the updrafts here, sometimes flying below hikers, reversing the usual order of things. The exposure is complete. There's no hiding from sun or wind or rain, no shelter except motion, keeping walking until you reach the other side, It's a geography reduced to essentials: rock, air, and the narrow path between them. Popham Beach State Park performs a magic trick with sand, losing and gaining up to 50 acres of shoreline annually as offshore currents shift the Morse River's mouth back and forth like a pendulum. One year, the beach extends nearly to islands offshore at low tide. The next year, those same islands require a boat to reach. The river and ocean can't agree on boundaries, so they constantly renegotiate, moving millions of tons of sand in arguments conducted in current and tide. Beach houses built safely back from high tide find themselves threatened, then safe again, as the beach advances and retreats in cycles that span decades. Walking here in winter after a storm, you might find trees exposed that have been buried for years, their salt-preserved trunks emerging like archaeological discoveries. Or you might find new dunes where yesterday there was flat beach, formed overnight by wind and wave in collaboration. The sand here is different colors at different depths: white on top, gray beneath, sometimes revealing garnets and other heavy minerals sorted by waves into purple-black ribbons that disappear with the next tide. The Rangeley Lakes float at 1,500 feet elevation, a quartet of water bodies that once formed a single massive lake before glacial debris divided them. At this height, winter comes a month earlier and stays a month later than the coast, ice forming in October and lingering into May. The lakes, Rangeley, Moose Lukmaguntik, Richardson, and Umbagog, create their own weather system, clouds forming over the water and precipitating on the surrounding mountains in a cycle that rarely stops. The elevation makes the water clearer somehow, as if proximity to sky purifies it. Brook trout here grow to unusual size, feeding in water so cold it holds extra oxygen, allowing them to remain active even in summer when lowland trout become sluggish. The lakes remember their unity. In flood years, they nearly reconnect, water finding the old channels between them. From the air, you can see the ghost of the original lake, traced in wetlands and low ground, a geography of memory written in marsh grass and alder. Eeloo rises from Penobscot Bay, with 18 miles of rocky coastline wrapped around just 7 square miles of land, yet only 45 people call it home year-round. The ratio of shore to resident means each person theoretically has nearly half a mile of coast to themselves, though the rocky shores are more likely to host seals than humans. Half the island belongs to Acadia National Park, the other half to descendants of fishermen who've been here for centuries. The name, given by Champlain, means high island, and from the water it does seem improbably tall, its spruce-covered ridge rising 400 feet like a green wall. In winter, when summer residents leave and the park closes, the island becomes almost prehistoric in its emptiness. The mailboat comes 3 times a week, weather permitting, bringing supplies and gossip from the mainland. Fog can isolate the island for days, wrapping it in gray wool so thick that neighbors become invisible to each other. It's a place where geography enforces community. Everyone knows everyone because there's nowhere else to go, no way to avoid the reckoning of small island life. Deep in Maine's northern forest, the Debskoniag ice caves maintain winter year-round. These caves, carved into granite bedrock by millennia of freeze-thaw cycles, create their own refrigeration through a combination of cold air drainage and insulation. Even in August, when the forest above swelters in humidity, ice persists in the deepest chambers, and temperatures never rise above 40 degrees. The caves breathe. Cold air flows out of lower entrances in summer, drawing warm air in through upper openings, creating a natural circulation that maintains the cold. Entering them feels like stepping into winter's storage room, where February waits out July. The ice formations inside change constantly, but never disappear entirely. Stalactites of frozen seepage that grow all summer as water drips and freezes. Animals know these caves, using them as refuge from summer heat. Porcupines, foxes, even black bears have been found resting in the entrance chambers where cold air pools. The caves are unmarked on most maps, protected by difficulty of access and the silent agreement of those who know about them that some places should remain hard to find. Penobscot Bay opens like a hand with too many fingers, containing over 200 islands scattered across 1,100 square miles of water. It's Maine's second-largest bay, a geography of islands and channels, of reaches and passages that create hundreds of small worlds. Each island has its own story. Some have villages, some have single houses, some have only birds. The bay is really a drowned river valley, flooded when glaciers melted and sea levels rose, turning hilltops into islands and valleys into channels. The water depth varies dramatically. Shallow bars where lobster boats scrape bottom at low tide, deep holes where submarine testing was once conducted. From the air, the bay looks like shattered glass, its islands fragments of a mainland that broke apart. But from water level, each island is complete unto itself, a small planet with its own horizons. The tides here are complex, influenced by the shape of the bottom, the direction of channels, the phase of the moon. Local mariners know tides specific to individual coves, times that appear in no official table. Mount Agamenticus rises only 692 feet, barely a hill by mountain standards. Yet from its summit, on clear days, you can see Mount Washington 80 miles north and Boston's skyline 75 miles south. This seemingly modest bump in southern Maine's coastal plain sits in exactly the right place, the only height for miles in any direction, making it a landmark visible from the sea, a navigation point that sailors have used for centuries. The mountain is a monadnock, a resistant core of rock that survived while softer stone around it eroded away. The summit holds communication towers now, but also remnants of a fire tower from when humans watched for smoke rather than signals. The mountain creates its own weather, forcing coastal air upward where it cools and drops rain, making the summit notably wetter than surrounding lowlands. In spring, hawks use the updrafts created by the sun-warmed slopes, spiraling upward in kettles of dozens, sometimes hundreds of birds, all riding the same invisible elevator of air. The Saco River travels 136 miles from the White Mountains to the Atlantic, dropping only 1,200 feet along its entire length, one of the gentlest gradients of any major river in New England. This leisurely descent creates a river that seems in no hurry, meandering through meadows, pooling in long, quiet stretches where canoeists drift more than paddle. The river has cut oxbows that became lakes, abandoned channels that fill only in spring floods. In summer, the river sometimes seems more sand than water, with beaches appearing at every bend, temporary islands that last until the next high water. The Saco was the highway for log drives until the 1940s. Millions of logs floating from mountain forests to coastal mills. You can still find iron spikes and rocks where boom chains were anchored, rusted reminders of when the river worked for a living. Despite its gentle nature, the river has moments of violence, spring floods that reshape its course, ice jams that pile house-high, sudden rises that catch swimmers unaware. At Roque Bluffs State Park, nature has created an unusual arrangement. A freshwater pond sits just 100 yards from the ocean, separated only by a barrier beach of cobbles and sand. The pond and ocean never mix, maintaining completely different ecosystems within shouting distance of each other. Children swim in the warm pond while their parents brave the cold Atlantic. two water experiences separated by a few minutes' walk. The barrier beach rebuilds itself after every storm, waves pushing cobbles into new arrangements, somehow always maintaining the separation. The pond is fed by springs and rainfall, its level rising and falling independently of the tides beyond the beach. On calm days, you can hear both waters, the rhythmic crash of ocean waves and the gentler lap of pond wavelets, two water songs in different keys. It's a geographical improbability that shouldn't exist but does, maintained by the precise balance of forces that could change with any significant storm, yet hasn't for recorded history. Maine's continental shelf extends 100 miles offshore before plunging to depths of 9,000 feet, an underwater cliff invisible from the surface but dramatic as any mountain range. This hidden geography determines everything: where fish gather, where whales feed, how storms behave approaching the coast. The shelf is the true edge of the continent, the real boundary between land and deep ocean. George Bank, Cash's Ledge, Jeffrey's Ledge. These underwater mountains rise from the shelf, creating upwellings that bring nutrients from the deep, feeding the food chain from plankton to whales. Fishing boats work contours invisible from the surface, following bottom features mapped by sonar, hunting along edges where shallow meets deep. In winter storms, waves that have traveled thousands of miles across deep Atlantic suddenly feel bottom on the shelf edge, rising up, their energy compressed into walls of water that can reach heights of 60 feet or more. The Camden Hills rise directly from sea level to nearly 1,400 feet in less than a mile, the steepest coastal elevation gain in the eastern United States. This abrupt rise creates dramatic views, but also dramatic weather. Fog that stops at treeline, rain on the summit while the harbor below stays dry, snow at elevation while the town sees rain. The hills force weather systems upward so quickly that clouds form spontaneously on humid days, wreathing the summits while the coast basks in sun. The geology here is complex, metamorphic rocks twisted into patterns that tell of continental collisions, granite intrusions that speak of underground fires. From the ocean, the hills look like a wall, green in summer, orange and red in fall, white in winter. Peregrine falcons nest on the cliff faces, using the same updrafts that hikers struggle against. The hills have their own growing season, spring arriving 2 weeks later at the summit than the harbor, fall colors beginning at the top and flowing downward like slow paint. Chesuncook Lake spreads across 26,000 acres of northern Maine wilderness, its 90 miles of shoreline untouched by roads, accessible only by boat or floatplane. This is Maine's third largest lake, yet you could spend days here without seeing another person. The lake fills a glacial basin, its arms reaching into valleys like fingers exploring the landscape. Mount Katahdin rises to the east, visible from much of the lake, a granite guardian watching over waters that freeze 3 feet thick in winter. The lake's name means place of the principal outlet in Penobscot, referring to where it drains into the west branch of the Penobscot River. Loons nest on its islands, their calls echoing across water so still that stars reflect perfectly on calm nights. The surrounding forest has been logged multiple times, but always selectively, never clear-cut, maintaining a wilderness character even if not wilderness fact. In autumn, the maples and birches surrounding the lake create a rim of fire, their colors doubled in reflection, the lake holding autumn twice. The Cranberry Isles float in the waters south of Mount Desert Island like thoughts that drifted away from the mainland and decided to stay. 5 islands make up this small archipelago: Great Cranberry, Little Cranberry, Sutton, Baker, and Bear, together totaling just 900 acres of land. But at low tide, something remarkable happens. 57 smaller ledges and rocks emerge from the water, temporary islands that exist for a few hours before the sea reclaims them. The islands take their name from the wild cranberry bogs that once covered them, though most have been replaced by spruce forest and summer cottages. Year-round populations on the inhabited islands number fewer than 200 souls, people who know the mood of every tide, the meaning of every wind shift. In winter, when ice forms between the islands, seals use the temporary platforms to rest, their dark bodies scattered like punctuation marks on white pages. The mailboat serves as lifeline and social hub, bringing supplies and news from the mainland, its schedule dictated by weather that can change from calm to dangerous in the time it takes to load groceries. High in the western mountains, Tumbledown Mountain harbors a secret, an alpine pond at 3,000 feet elevation that never fully freezes, even when temperatures plummet to 30 below. Fed by underground springs that bubble up through cracks in the granite bedrock, the pond maintains a constant temperature just above freezing, creating an oasis of liquid water in a landscape locked in ice. The pond sits in a cirque, a bowl carved by glaciers, surrounded by cliffs that rise another 500 feet. Swimming here in summer feels like swimming in the sky, with views that extend to Mount Washington on clear days. The water is so clear you can see every stone on the bottom, count individual grains of sand. The springs that feed it must travel deep through the mountain, picking up just enough geothermal heat to resist freezing. Arctic char once lived here, introduced in the 1800s, though they've since disappeared, leaving the pond to native newts and fairy shrimp that survive the near-freezing temperatures. It's a place that shouldn't exist at this elevation, this latitude, a geographic impossibility made real by hidden springs. The Kennebec River transforms at the forks, where the Dead River joins it, creating 12 miles of whitewater that drops 90 feet per mile through a granite gorge. The river here has moods that change with rainfall hundreds of miles away, rising and falling dramatically, sometimes within hours. The gorge walls rise 200 feet on either side, creating a canyon that funnels wind and water into chaos. Rapids have names that tell stories: Magic Falls, where rafts seem to disappear entirely in the foam; Whitewasher, which flips more boats than any other; Big Mama, whose hydraulic can hold a raft for long seconds while passengers wonder if they'll ever escape. The water temperature rarely exceeds 45 degrees, even in summer, fed by bottom-release dams that discharge water from depths where sunlight never reaches. In the gorge, the roar is constant, a white noise that becomes hypnotic, drowning out thought. Osprey nest on dead trees along the rim, fishing in the calmer pools between rapids where stunned fish gather. The geology here is young by Maine standards, carved in the last 10,000 years as post-glacial floods found weak spots in the bedrock. Great Wass Island preserves something remarkable: the largest stand of jack pine south of Canada, 1,500 acres of a subarctic species growing at the southern edge of its range. These pines, more common in Labrador and northern Quebec, found refuge here in the unique microclimate created by cold ocean currents and frequent fog. The trees grow slowly, twisted by constant wind into forms that seem more sculptural than botanical. Some pines, over a century old, stand only 20 feet tall, their trunks thick as a person's waist, every ring in their wood representing a year of struggle against salt and storm. The island's interior holds peat bogs where carnivorous plants trap insects, where orchids bloom in colors that seem impossible this far north. Walking through the jack pine stands feels like entering another latitude, as if you've traveled 500 miles north in a few steps. The forest floor is carpeted with reindeer lichen, the same species that feeds caribou in the Arctic. Fog moves through these pines differently than through other trees, condensing on needles and dripping constantly, creating a percussive rhythm that becomes meditative. Lake Umbagog straddles the border between Maine and New Hampshire, like it can't decide which state to call home. 40 miles of its shoreline remain completely undeveloped, protected as a national wildlife refuge, where loons outnumber houses 50 to 1. The lake's name comes from the Abenaki, meaning clear water, though in truth, the water is dark, stained by tannins from the surrounding wetlands to the color of strong tea. The lake is shallow for its size, averaging only 15 feet deep, which means it warms quickly in summer and freezes completely in winter. Moose wade through its shallows in numbers seen nowhere else in the region, sometimes a dozen visible at once, their massive bodies half submerged as they feed on aquatic plants. The Androscoggin River both enters and exits the lake, making it more of a wide spot in the river than a true lake, constantly flushing, constantly renewed. Osprey and eagles compete for fish here, their territorial battles played out in aerial displays that reflect in the dark water. At night, with no lights visible except stars, the lake becomes a mirror of the sky, doubling the universe. In Acadia, two mountains called the Bubbles, north and south, rise like giants' marbles balanced on the landscape. These twin peaks aren't ordinary mountains, but rare geological features called roches moutonnées, formed entirely from glacial deposits rather than bedrock uplift. When the ice sheet retreated, it left these enormous piles of gravel and till, which time has worn smooth and covered with forest. From Jordan Pond below, they appear perfectly rounded, like bubbles about to float away. The geological improbability of their existence makes them fascinating. They shouldn't have survived 12,000 years of erosion, yet here they stand. Between them, a small valley holds Bubble Rock, a house-sized boulder perched so precariously on the edge of South Bubble that it seems a strong wind should topple it, though it has balanced there since the glaciers placed it. The rocks that compose the bubbles traveled here from hundreds of miles north, carried in the ice, each stone an immigrant from somewhere else. Hiking them feels different from climbing bedrock mountains. The ground shifts slightly underfoot, the mountains still settling after all these millennia. Cobscook Bay experiences some of the world's most extreme tides, 24 feet of vertical change that moves 11 billion gallons of water twice daily. The bay's name means boiling tides in Passamaquoddy, and at maximum flow, the water does appear to boil, churning through narrow channels with such force that it creates reversing falls, waterfalls that flow different directions depending on the tide. The bay is really a collection of bays, a fractal coastline where every inlet has inlets, where measuring the shoreline depends on how closely you look. At low tide, the bay empties almost completely, exposing vast mudflats where thousands of acres that were underwater 6 hours earlier become temporary land. Clam diggers work these flats in the narrow windows between tides, racing the returning water. The twice-daily exchange of water keeps the bay incredibly productive. Nutrients flow in and out like breath, feeding everything from microscopic plankton to harbor seals. In the narrow passages between islands, the tidal current can exceed 8 knots, faster than most small boats can motor against. Whirlpools form and dissipate, temporary geography that exists for minutes before the water moves on. Spencer Mountain marks a significant moment in continental geography. At 3,230 feet, it represents the northern terminus, of the Appalachian mountain chain's continuous ridgeline that begins in Georgia. North of here, mountains exist as isolated peaks rather than connected chains. Standing on Spencer's summit, you're at the end of a 2,000-mile-long wrinkle in the Earth's crust, a geological sentence that ends here in Maine woods. The mountain sees weather from all directions: Atlantic storms from the east, Arctic cold from the north, continental weather from the west. Snow can fall here any month of the year, and sometimes does. Brief summer squalls that dust the summit while valleys swelter. The approach to Spencer is through logging lands, roads that appear and disappear with timber harvests, making every visit slightly different. From the top, the view extends into Canada, where mountains continue, but no longer connected, no longer part of the same geological story. The Appalachian Trail originally ended here before being extended to Katahdin, and there's something fitting about that. This feels like an ending place, a geography of conclusion. The Scarborough Marsh spreads across 3,100 acres, Maine's largest salt marsh, a landscape that exists between land and sea, never quite one or the other. Twice daily, tides transform it completely. At high tide, it's a vast lake dotted with grass islands. At low tide, it's a prairie crossed by muddy channels. The marsh filters 450 million gallons of tidal water daily, acting as nature's water treatment plant, removing nutrients and sediments before they reach the ocean. Great blue herons stand motionless in the channels, waiting for fish that move with the tides. The grass here, Spartina, has adapted to live in salt water, with special glands that excrete salt crystals that glitter on the leaves like diamonds in morning sun. The marsh produces more biomass per acre than the most fertile farmland, all of it eventually feeding the ocean's food web. Walking the trails through the marsh, especially at dawn or dusk, you enter a primordial landscape, unchanged since before humans arrived. The sounds are ancient: the rustle of grass in wind, the splash of unseen creatures, the cry of birds that have been fishing these waters for millions of years. Flagstaff Lake covers 20,000 acres, but beneath its waters lie 3 complete towns: Flagstaff, Bigelow, and Dead River, flooded in 1950 when the Dead River was dammed. The lake is shallow, only 30 feet at its deepest, which means that in drought years, the old towns sometimes emerge. Foundations appear, roadbeds become visible. The stumps of trees cut just before flooding stand like markers of the past. On calm days, locals say you can see the roads beneath the water, following their routes in boats along main streets, now traveled by fish. The villages had existed for over a century before the flood, and their residents fought the dam for years before finally accepting buyouts and watching their homes disappear beneath rising water. The lake created is beautiful but haunted, a geography of loss. In winter, when ice fishermen drill holes, they sometimes pull up pieces of the past: bottles, tools, fragments of lives lived below. The name Flagstaff came from Benedict Arnold's expedition to Quebec, when surveyors raised a flag on the mountain that the lake now reflects. The flag is gone, the mountain remains, but the town that took the name exists only underwater. Mount Blue State Park hides evidence of cosmic violence, a perfectly circular crater 600 feet in diameter, one of only 4 confirmed meteorite impact sites in Maine. The crater, now filled with vegetation and slowly filling with sediment, marks where a piece of another world struck ours with the force of multiple atomic bombs. The impact, estimated at 10,000 years ago, would have been visible for hundreds of miles, a fireball that turned night to day, followed by a shockwave that flattened forests. Today, it's peaceful, almost unnoticeable, unless you know what to look for. A depression too round to be natural, rocks showing signs of shock metamorphism, tiny glass beads formed from melted stone. The crater has become a bog, where rare plants grow in the unique conditions created by the impact. Water pools here differently than in the surrounding landscape, creating a microclimate several degrees cooler than the nearby slopes. Scientists studying the crater have found microscopic diamonds, formed in the instant of impact when carbon was compressed beyond earthly pressures. It's a reminder that Maine's geography includes extraterrestrial contributions, that the landscape we see includes violence from space. The chain of ponds isn't really a chain, but more of a rosary of water, 11 separate ponds connected by streams so small you could step across them, following the Maine-Quebec border like a dotted line on a map. These ponds occupy a glacial meltwater channel, the route torrents of water took when the ice sheet melted, carving a valley that later filled with a string of waters. Each pond has its own character, some deep and clear, others shallow and weedy, some round as coins, others stretched like tears. Together, they create a canoe route that's been used for thousands of years, first by indigenous peoples, then by Benedict Arnold's army, then by log drivers, now by paddlers seeking solitude. The ponds freeze in sequence, the smallest first, the largest last, like watching winter arrive in slow motion. In spring, ice goes out in reverse order, creating a weeks-long season when some ponds are clear, while others remain locked in ice. Between the ponds, the connecting streams sometimes disappear underground, flowing through gravel for hundreds of feet before emerging, making the chain seem broken until you realize the water continues, just hidden. Machias, Seal Island, just 20 acres of rock and grass, remains the last disputed territory between the United States and Canada. Both nations claim it. Both have claimed it since 1832, neither willing to give up this tiny piece of Atlantic real estate. The dispute stems from ambiguous treaty language about islands in the Bay of Fundy versus Gulf of Maine, different interpretations of where one ends and the other begins. Canada maintains a lighthouse here, staffed year-round to maintain sovereignty. The United States issues lobster licenses for the surrounding waters. The island itself seems indifferent to nationality, home to the largest colony of Atlantic puffins in the Gulf of Maine, birds that don't recognize human borders. During nesting season, the island transforms into a city of birds, puffins, razorbills, terns, tens of thousands of wings and voices. Visitors are limited, requiring permission from either government, though which government depends on your citizenship. The lighthouse keepers are essentially guards of Canada's claim, maintaining presence in one of the most isolated posts in North America. In fog, which is frequent, the island disappears entirely, becoming a ghost territory that exists more in legal documents than physical reality. Grand Lake Stream flows for only 3 miles, one of Maine's shortest named rivers. Yet in those 3 miles, it drops 27 feet through 21 distinct pools, creating a natural fish ladder that Atlantic salmon navigate like an aquatic staircase. Each pool has a name among fishing guides: home pool, hatchery pool, Little Falls, and each fishes differently depending on water temperature, time of day, season. The stream connects Grand Lake to Big Lake, part of a vast watershed that drains eastern Maine. The water runs so consistently that a century ago, it powered mills that made the wooden forms for baseball gloves, the only place in America where the right wood grew. The stream's gradient is perfect, steep enough to oxygenate the water, gentle enough for fish to ascend. In June, when salmon run, you can watch them leap from pool to pool, silver bodies catching light as they power upstream. The stream bed is all gravel and stone, perfect for spawning, cleaned by spring floods that wash away silt. It's a geography compressed, an entire river's worth of character packed into 3 miles. The Oxford Hills contain the highest concentration of mineral deposits in North America, 70 documented pegmatite quarries within 15 square miles, a geological candy store of rare minerals. These pegmatites formed when the last juices of cooling granite concentrated rare elements into pockets and veins. Tourmaline in every color, beryl crystals the size of logs, mica sheets you could use as windows. The hills have produced gems for museums worldwide: the Smithsonian, the Harvard Mineralogical Museum, private collections in dozens of countries. Some quarries are still worked, others abandoned, slowly filling with water that turns unusual colors from dissolved minerals: turquoise from copper, rust from iron, clear as air where quartz dominates. Rock hounds come from around the world, searching for that one pocket that might contain something never seen before. The geology here is so complex that new mineral species are still being discovered, combinations of elements that exist nowhere else on Earth. Walking through these hills, every rock face might hide treasures. Every pile of debris might contain a museum piece. It's a landscape where the ordinary and extraordinary exist side by side, where a gray rock might split to reveal purple crystals, where geology becomes art. Moosehead Lake stretches 35 miles long, Maine's largest lake, yet averages only 55 feet deep. A vast, shallow pan of water with over 80 islands scattered across its surface like seeds. The lake's shallowness means it responds quickly to wind, changing from mirror calm to 6-foot waves in minutes. The islands range from substantial, Sugar Island with its village ruins, to mere rocks that appear only at low water. Each island creates its own wake pattern when wind blows, streams of calm water extending downwind like comet tails. Mount Caneo rises from the eastern shore, but from certain angles, islands align to frame it perfectly, as if arranged by design. The lake covers nearly 75,000 acres, large enough to create its own weather, fog forming over the water and flowing into surrounding valleys like slow rivers of cloud. In winter, the ice reaches 3 feet thick, strong enough to support loaded logging trucks, though pressure ridges can form overnight, walls of jumbled ice pushed up by expansion. The lake's size means ice out is dramatic, a weeks-long process as different bays clear at different times, the ice breaking into plates the size of football fields. Otter Cliffs in Acadia drop 110 feet straight into the Atlantic, the highest coastal headlands north of Rio de Janeiro on the entire American Atlantic seaboard. These aren't just cliffs, but a statement of defiance, granite refusing to yield to ocean. The rock here is pinkish Cadillac granite, formed deep underground and exposed by millions of years of erosion. At high tide, waves explode against the base, sending spray nearly to the top. At low tide, the exposed rock shows centuries of tidal erosion carved into fantastic shapes: caves, arches, pillars. Peregrine falcons nest on ledges halfway down, raising young on a vertical world most humans experience only from above or below. The cliffs face directly into Atlantic storms, taking the full force of hurricanes and nor'easters. After major storms, the rocks are draped with kelp thrown up from depths, temporary gardens that dry and blow away. From the top, looking down, vertigo is immediate and overwhelming. The sea seems to pull at you, the horizon tilts. Rock climbers come from around the world to climb these faces, though many routes are closed during nesting season. the birds having priority. The dead river earned its name from its incredibly slow flow before damming, water moving at barely a third of a mile per hour, taking 10 full days to travel its 43-mile length. The river was more like a long, thin lake, barely moving, hence dead. Logs floated down it would arrive weeks after being released, if they arrived at all. Many simply waterlogged and sank, creating log jams that further slowed the flow. The river's sluggishness came from its extremely gentle gradient, dropping only inches per mile through broad valleys. Spring floods could reverse its flow entirely, water backing up for miles. Now dammed and renamed Flagstaff Lake and its upper reaches, the old river exists only in its lower section, though even there it moves faster than historically, controlled by dam releases. The original Dead River Valley was extraordinarily fertile, the slow water-dropping sediments year after year, creating soil so rich that farms established there were among Maine's most productive before the flooding. Old-timers say that in drought years, when Flagstaff Lake drops low, you can still see the furrows of the last plowing, straight lines in the lake bottom, waiting for seeds that will never come. Vinalhaven Island is surrounded by 60 smaller islands, creating 166 miles of shoreline, despite the main island being only 25 square miles in area. This fractal coastline, where every cove has coves, where every point has points, creates a geography that's impossible to fully know. Some of the surrounding islands are large enough to have names and histories: Green's Island, Brimstone, Dogfish. Others are just ledges that appear at low tide. The ratio of shoreline to area is among the highest of any inhabited island in the world, meaning wherever you are on Vinalhaven, you're never more than a few minutes from salt water. The island's granite quarries once provided stone for major buildings from Boston to Washington, leaving behind swimming holes of extraordinary depth and clarity, their walls still showing the drill marks from a century ago. The surrounding waters are a maze that local lobstermen navigate by memory, knowing which passages are safe at which tides, which ledges appear where. In fog, which can last for weeks in summer, the island becomes even more isolated, ferries canceled, planes grounded, the outside world reduced to rumor. At Grafton Notch, the Bear River has carved Screw Auger Falls, a 23-foot deep corkscrew channel through solid granite, nature operating as a patient sculptor. The falls got their name from the spiral pattern the water carved, resembling the auger drill bits loggers once used. Over 25,000 years, the river found a weakness in the granite and exploited it, grain by grain, creating a smooth-walled canyon that seems impossible, too perfect to be natural. The water here doesn't just fall, but spirals, following the helical channel it carved, entering as a sheet and exiting as a twisted rope. In spring, when snow melt swells the river, the falls become violent, the entire gorge filling with foam and fury. In late summer, when water runs low, you can see the full sculpture, the way water carved not just down but around, creating pools connected by curved channels that look designed by an artist who understood fluid dynamics intuitively. The granite here is particularly hard, which is why the carving took so long and why the edges remain sharp, unworn by the thousands of years since the carving slowed. The Bigelow Range extends 12 miles above 3,500 feet elevation, a high ridge that creates its own weather system independent of the valleys just 2 miles away. The range acts like a wall across western Maine, forcing weather systems upward where they cool and drop moisture, creating localized storms that form and dissipate without ever leaving the mountains. Hikers report experiencing 4 seasons in a single day, starting in summer heat, climbing through spring flowers, into winter conditions at the ridge, then descending back through the seasons. The range was nearly dammed in the 1970s, a plan that would have created the largest lake in Maine, flooding everything below 3,000 feet. Public outcry saved it, preserving this sky island where alpine plants grow that belong hundreds of miles north. Clouds form against the range even on clear days, created by the mountains themselves as warm air rises and cools. In winter, the ridge generates its own snow, what meteorologists call orographic lift, squeezing moisture from air that seems to hold none. The mountains here are named for a surveyor who died young, but the range itself speaks of persistence, maintaining its own climate despite the world around it. Casco Bay spreads before Portland like a handful of islands thrown by a careless giant. Legend claims there are 365 islands here, one for each day of the year, though modern surveys count only 222 larger than half an acre. The discrepancy depends on definitions. What makes an island? How large must a rock be to earn the name? At low tide, many more appear, temporary lands that exist for hours before disappearing again. The bay is really a drowned river valley, the ancient course of the Presumpscot River before sea levels rose. Each island tells a different story. Some have forts, some have farms, some have single houses reached only by boat. Together they create a maritime maze, channels and passages that require local knowledge to navigate safely. The calendar association persists in local culture, as if the bay needed numerical significance to justify its beauty. But the real magic isn't in the counting, but in the way morning fog reveals and conceals different islands, how the archipelago seems to reshape itself daily, never quite the same bay twice. Ferries weave between the islands on routes unchanged for a century, their schedules the heartbeat of island life. On Grafton Loop Trail, Table Rock extends 30 feet from the mountain with no visible support underneath, a granite platform balanced by the mountain's grip alone. Standing on it requires faith in geology, trust that millions of years of stability will continue for the few minutes you're there. The rock is a cantilever, the mountain's weight holding it in place, though looking at it from the side makes this seem impossible. The platform offers views into the valley that feel stolen, as if you're somewhere you shouldn't be, suspended in space. In winter, ice forms underneath, creating frozen waterfalls that hang from nothing. The approach requires scrambling up granite slabs polished smooth by centuries of boots and weather. From Table Rock, you can see the curvature of valleys carved by glaciers, the way ice followed the path of least resistance, creating the geography we inherit. The drop below is immediate and absolute, nothing but air for hundreds of feet. Hawks use the updrafts here, rising past at eye level, making you feel briefly that you too could step off and soar. But gravity is patient, and the rock, despite its impossible appearance, remains firmly attached to the mountain, a testament to the strength of stone. The west branch of the Penobscot River drains 2,100 square miles of northern forest, an area larger than Delaware, all funneling through rapids and gorges toward the sea. This watershed includes most of the North Maine woods, commercial forest lands where trees are harvested but never cleared, maintaining a working wilderness. The river was the highway for the great log drives, millions of trees floating toward mills, a practice that continued into the 1970s. Now it runs cleaner, though still colored brown by tannins from the forest, what locals call root beer water. The West Branch has moods that change with rainfall in Quebec, water from another country, determining whether rapids run heavy or light. In the gorges, the river has carved potholes the size of houses, perfect cylinders drilled by spinning stones over millennia. The The watershed is so vast that rain falling on its edges takes weeks to reach the main stem, creating a delayed response to weather that makes the river seem to have memory. Salmon are returning after a century's absence, finding their way up fish ladders, reclaiming pools their ancestors knew. It's a geography of recovery, a landscape learning to be wild again. Reed State Park holds two rare gifts on Maine's predominantly rocky coast: Mile Beach and Half Mile Beach, sandy stretches formed by river sediment, accumulated over 6,000 years. The Sheepscot and Little Rivers have been delivering sand grain by grain, building beaches where geology suggests there should be none. These beaches shouldn't exist. The coast here is granite, hostile to sand, swept by currents that should carry sediment away. Yet through a quirk of geometry, where rivers meet sea at just the right angle, sand accumulates rather than disperses. The beaches change personality with seasons, wide and welcoming in summer, narrow and violent in winter when storms reshape them overnight. Between the beaches, a rocky headland provides perspective on this sandy anomaly, these temporary geologies that might disappear with the next ice age or the next hurricane. Piping plovers nest here, tiny birds that depend on this exact habitat, this narrow margin between land and sea. The sand itself tells stories under magnification: grains of quartz from mountain granite, garnets from metamorphic rocks, magnetite that aligns with compass needles, each grain an immigrant from somewhere inland. Mount Katahdin stands in magnificent isolation. The nearest peak over 4,000 feet is Mount Washington, 110 miles away. This solitude makes Katahdin the most prominent peak in the Northeast, rising from relatively flat surroundings like a monument to verticality. The mountain creates its own weather through sheer presence, forcing air upward into temperatures that can differ by 40 degrees from base to summit. The isolation means Katahdin is visible from impossible distances, from the ocean on clear days, from Cadillac Mountain, from hills in Canada. The mountain stands alone because geology placed it alone, a pluton of granite that resisted erosion, while softer rocks around it wore away. This isolation creates unique conditions. Plants grow here found nowhere else in Maine. Weather forms here that exists nowhere else. Ice persists in ravines through summer. The Penobscot people call it Katahdin, the greatest mountain, not the tallest, but the greatest, understanding that prominence matters more than elevation. Standing on its summit, you can turn in a full circle and see no other high peaks, only the mountain's shadow stretching across a landscape that seems to bow before this singular giant. On the west branch, Cribworks Rapids crashes through granite ledges where remnants of 19th century log driving structures still grip the rocks. The rapids drop 20 feet in a quarter mile, not vertically but in steps, each ledge creating its own hydraulic, its own trap for logs and later, rafts. The cribworks were wooden structures filled with rocks that channeled logs through safe passages, preventing jams that could back up timber for miles. Iron spikes still protrude from granite where these structures were anchored, rusted but solid, refusing to let go after more than a century. The water here runs root beer brown from forest tannins, making it impossible to see rocks below the surface until you're upon them. In high water, the rapids become a single white roar, individual features lost in chaos. In low water, you can see the engineering, the way log drivers modified the river, tried to tame it enough to use it. The modifications are failing slowly, wood rotting, rocks shifting, the river reclaiming its original path. Each year, the rapids become a little more natural, a little less industrial, gradually forgetting their working past. Campobello Island belongs to Canada, but connects only to the United States, a geographic irony that makes it more accessible from Maine than from its own nation. The bridge from Lubec is the only year-round road access, while reaching it from Canada requires 2 ferry rides in summer or a long drive through Maine in winter. This peculiarity creates an island that lives between countries, Canadian in law but American in practice. Roosevelt had his summer home here, finding something in the island's ambiguous nationality that suited him. The island stretches along the border like a question mark, its eastern shore facing the Bay of Fundy, where tides rise 20 feet, its western shore looking at Maine across narrows so narrow you could shout across. Residents shop in Maine, work in Maine, but vote in Canada, living a binational existence that predates modern borders. The island's geology ignores political boundaries. The same volcanic rocks that form Maine's bold coast continue here. The same tides that sweep Cobscook Bay sweep these shores. It's a reminder that geography and politics rarely align, that borders are human inventions overlaid on landscapes that recognize no nations. Long Lake in Naples stretches 11 miles long, but never more than a mile wide, carved by glaciers following an ancient river valley that predates the ice. The lake's narrowness creates unusual conditions. Winds funnel down its length, creating sailing conditions that change, predictably, with distance from either end. The lake is really several lakes connected by narrows, each section with its own name among locals, its own fishing spots, its own summer community. In the narrows, the current reverses with wind direction, sometimes flowing north, sometimes south, as if the lake can't decide which way to drain. The glacier that carved it was precise, following the buried valley exactly, creating a lake that maps an older geography, a river that flowed here before ice rewrote the landscape. Houses line much of the shore now, but in early morning, before humans wake, the lake remembers its wildness. Loons call, mist rises in columns, and for a few hours it could be any century. The lake freezes in sections, the narrows first where current is weakest, then spreading outward until the whole lake locks solid, becoming a highway for ice fishermen and snowmobiles. The Grand Manan Channel beside Maine's bold coast plunges to depths of 400 feet, creating a submarine canyon that brings Arctic water to Maine's shores. This deep channel acts as a highway for marine life, a migration route for whales following temperature gradients invisible from the surface. The channel creates upwellings, deep water forced to the surface, carrying nutrients that support the entire food web. The depth here is surprising. You can be a stone's throw from shore, yet floating above water deeper than most skyscrapers are tall. The channel marks the true edge of the continent, where the geology of land gives way to the geology of ocean floor. Ships have foundered here in clear weather, caught by currents that can exceed 6 knots, pulled down by whirlpools that form where different water masses meet. Fishermen respect the channel, knowing it holds the biggest fish, but also the biggest dangers. In winter, the temperature difference between shallow and deep water creates fog banks that sit precisely over the channel, a river of fog marking the invisible canyon below. The channel remembers the glaciers, carved when sea levels were lower, when this was a river valley before the ocean claimed it. A Ziskahos Lake spreads across the mountains near the New Hampshire border, its name meaning Place of the Small Pines in Abenaki. Though the pines it was named for drowned when the dam was built in 1911. The lake is artificial but has aged into naturalness, its shores now lined with forest that doesn't remember the valley below. The original pines, preserved in cold water, sometimes surface during extreme low water, ghost trees from a drowned forest. The lake fills multiple valleys, creating arms that reach in different directions, each valley maintaining its own character, some shallow and weedy, others deep and clear. The dam that created it was part of the industrial transformation of Maine's rivers, turning falling water into electricity, drowning the sacred to power the profane. Yet the lake has become beautiful in its own right, reflecting mountains, hosting loons, providing what humans consider recreation. Moose wade its shallows, unaware of its artificial origins. Eagles nest in trees that grow where once was air. The transformation is complete enough that most visitors never question the lake's existence, accepting it as natural as the mountains it reflects. North Haven Island maintains 54 miles of roads, but not a single traffic light or stop sign, a community that governs movement through courtesy rather than command. The island sits in Penobscot Bay, connected to the world only by ferry, 3 times daily in summer, less in winter. This isolation creates a society that operates by different rules, where everyone knows everyone's car, where yielding becomes a conversation conducted in gestures. The roads follow old cart paths, winding around granite outcroppings rather than through them, accepting the landscape rather than conquering it. In summer, the population triples with summer residents, but even then, the absence of traffic control remains, as if signs would admit a complexity the island refuses to acknowledge. The ferry schedule determines the rhythm of life, arriving for the morning boat, meeting the afternoon boat, planning around the last boat. Missing it means a night on the mainland or an expensive water taxi. The roads are narrow enough that passing requires negotiation, one car backing to a wide spot while the other proceeds. It's a geography that enforces politeness, where the physical constraints of island life create social solutions. The Mahoosic Range contains Maine's most challenging hiking mile, Mahoosic Notch, a boulder-filled gorge that takes most hikers 2 hours to traverse a single mile. The Notch is what geologists call a joint valley, where the mountains split along a weakness, creating a chasm filled with house-sized boulders that fell from the walls above. Traversing it requires climbing over, under, and between granite blocks, following a route that exists more in 3 dimensions than 2. Ice persists in the deepest recesses through August, and the temperature can be 20 degrees cooler than the ridges above. The boulders create caves and tunnels, some large enough to walk through, others requiring crawling. Pack animals can't navigate it, and many hikers send their packs around rather than wrestle them through. The Notch has its own microclimate, its own ecology, plants growing here that belong in the Arctic. It's a place where distance becomes meaningless. A mile here is not the same as a mile elsewhere. Some hikers panic in the depths, where sky becomes a narrow strip far above, where the way forward isn't always obvious. Yet children often navigate it better than adults, their size and flexibility advantages in this collapsed geography. Coburn Mountain rises to 3,718 feet in the Western Mountains, high enough to support vegetation that belongs in Labrador. The summit hosts alpine, plants that survived the Ice Age here, refugees from a colder world that found sanctuary above treeline. These plants, mountain sandwort, alpine bilberry, Bigelow's sedge, grow in cushions and mats, hugging the ground to avoid wind that can exceed hurricane force. The mountain creates a sky island, an isolated ecosystem separated from similar habitats by hundreds of miles of unsuitable lowland. The plants here are genetically distinct from their northern relatives, having evolved in isolation for 12,000 years. In June, the summit blooms with tiny flowers that last only days, a brief explosion of color, in an otherwise harsh landscape. The soil where it exists is paper thin, built grain by grain from decomposed granite and the slow accumulation of organic matter. A careless footstep can destroy decades of growth. Scientists studying climate change monitor these plants as sentinels. If the world warms too much, they have nowhere higher to go. The mountain is a refuge becoming a trap, altitude replacing latitude until there's no replacement left. Swan Island rises from the Kennebec River, 1,700 acres accessible only by reservation-limited ferry, allowing just 60 visitors daily. The island is a wildlife preserve, but it's also a preserved moment in Maine's history, a village abandoned when economics shifted, leaving houses and a schoolhouse slowly being reclaimed by forest. The limitation on visitors creates an unusual experience, wandering trails where you might not see another person all day, despite being only 4 miles from the state capital. White-tailed deer have lost their fear of humans here, browsing within feet of the few visitors. Eagles nest in white pines along the shore, their young learning to fish in the river that surrounds and protects the island. The ferry ride is brief, but transformative. Those few minutes of water travel creating psychological distance that hours of driving couldn't achieve. The island was once home to a thriving community, ice cutters who harvested the Kennebec's frozen bounty. You can still see the foundations of ice houses, massive structures that stored winter for sale in summer. Now the island stores something else, a kind of silence that has become rare, a place where the loudest sound is often wind and leaves. Webster Lake on the east branch of the Penobscot spreads across 680 acres in a shape that, from above, looks exactly like an eagle in flight. The resemblance is so precise it seems intentional. Wings spread, head forward, talons extended. Yet it's entirely natural, carved by glaciers following fractures in the bedrock that happen to create this form. Local pilots use the lake as a navigation marker, the eagle shape unmistakable even from high altitude. The lake wasn't named for its shape, that was only discovered with aerial photography. But for an early surveyor who probably never knew he'd mapped a bird, the eagle flies northeast, forever, frozen in glacial time, its wings reflecting sky. In winter, when the lake freezes and snow covers it, the eagle disappears, becoming just another white space in a white landscape. But in summer, especially in early morning when mist rises from the water, the eagle seems about to lift off, to complete a flight begun by ice 12,000 years ago. It's a reminder that patterns exist at scales we can't perceive from the ground, that landscape has shapes that only distance reveals. Borestone Mountain rises to just under 2,000 feet, but holds 3 pristine alpine ponds at its summit, fed entirely by rain and snow with no inlet streams. These ponds shouldn't exist at this elevation in this climate, yet they persist, holding water year-round, except in the most severe droughts. Each pond has its own character, one clear, one dark with tannins, one that seems to change color with the sky. Together, they create a summit wetland that supports plants found nowhere else in central Maine. The ponds are called Sunrise, Midday, and Sunset by locals, though they have no official names. Moose climb here to escape summer heat and flies, wallowing in the shallow ponds, their tracks the only disturbance in the otherwise perfect reflections. The water is so pure that scientists use it to calibrate instruments, a baseline for what water can be without human influence. The ponds freeze from the bottom up, a rare phenomenon caused by their shallow depth and exposure, creating ice sculptures as pressure pushes frozen layers upward. No fish live here. The ponds have never been stocked, remaining as they were when the glaciers left them. mirrors for the sky that have reflected 12,000 years of clouds. Pierce Pond stretches 8 miles through mountains with no road touching its shores, surrounded by 20,000 acres of conservation land that ensures it will remain remote. The pond is really a widening of the Dead River's old channel, a pause in the water's journey to the Kennebec. To reach it requires commitment. Miles of logging roads, some gated, some washed out, some that disappear entirely in wet seasons. Those who make the journey find a lake that seems forgotten by the modern world, where loons outnumber boats 50 to 1, where the only structures are a few hunting camps used a few weeks each year. The pond is deep enough to stratify in summer, creating layers of different temperatures that fish use like floors in an aquatic building. In fall, when the layers mix, the pond turns over, bringing nutrients from the bottom to the surface, creating a brief feeding frenzy. The surrounding mountains catch clouds, ensuring the pond receives more rain than the valleys, keeping it full even in drought years. At night, with no lights visible in any direction, the stars reflect so clearly that paddlers say it's like floating in space, the universe doubled in still water. The Saddleback Mountain Ridge maintains elevation above 4,000 feet for 2 continuous miles, the longest alpine traverse in Maine. This extended height creates conditions usually found much farther north: Krumholtz forests where trees grow horizontally, alpine bogs where water sits on impermeable granite, fell fields where only the hardiest plants survive. The ridge is really 4 peaks connected by cols that barely dip below the magic 4,000-foot mark. Walking this ridge on a clear day feels like walking on the roof of Maine, everything below spread out like a map. But weather can change instantly here. Clouds form against the ridge, wrapping hikers in fog so thick that visibility drops to feet. The wind here has carved the rocks into fantastic shapes, and in winter, rime ice builds into formations that seem more sculpture than nature. The continuous elevation means the ridge has developed its own ecosystem. Species that exist here and nowhere else nearby evolved for this narrow strip of sky-high land. Snow can fall any month, and sometimes does. Brief summer squalls that dust the summit while valleys swelter, a reminder that altitude is latitude compressed, that climbing mountains is like traveling north without moving horizontally. Lobster Cove on Monhegan Island demonstrates geology in action, eroding 6 inches inland every year, the fastest coastal erosion rate in Maine. The cove is carved from schist, a metamorphic rock that splits along plains, creating cliffs that look like stacked books slowly sliding into the sea. Each winter storm takes a little more. Each spring tide undermines a bit further. Houses built a safe distance from the cliff edge a century ago have been moved back twice. The erosion is visible year to year. Photographers have documented the retreat, showing how a distinctive rock formation becomes a stack, becomes a stump, disappears entirely. The schist here is soft by coastal standards, compressed mud from an ancient seafloor, transformed by heat and pressure, but not enough to resist the Atlantic. Yet the erosion has created beauty. Sea caves where waves boom like drums, arches that frame perfect sunset views, tide pools in the carved terraces. The cove is a lesson in impermanence, a place where you can watch the earth change on a human timescale. Residents have stopped fighting the erosion, accepting that the island is slowly offering itself to the sea, piece by piece, inch by inch. Richardson Lake harbors a phenomenon that seems to belong in a fairy tale, a 40-acre mat of floating bog that moves around the lake with the wind, a living island that never anchors. This mat, thick enough to support full-grown trees, formed when sphagnum moss grew out from the shores, eventually breaking free to drift. Some days it blocks coves, other days it opens passages that were closed the day before. The trees growing on it lean at odd angles, their roots finding purchase in nothing more solid than centuries of compressed moss. When wind pushes the mat against the shore, you can walk onto it, though each step ripples outward like walking on a waterbed made of earth. Beneath the mat, fish swim in darkness, and occasionally a hole opens, revealing the lake below, black and unexpected. Local guides know to check its position before planning routes, as what was open water yesterday might be blocked today. The mat has been floating for at least a century, possibly much longer, a piece of land that chose freedom over stability. In autumn, when the trees on the mat turn colors different from those on shore, it becomes even more obviously separate, a world unto itself, following wind rather than bedrock. From the height of land overlook, 7 lakes reveal themselves simultaneously, spread across the landscape like mirrors dropped by giants. This is the only place in Maine where such a view exists, where geography aligns to show Moose Lukmaguntik, Rangeley, Upper Richardson, Lower Richardson, Azizkahos, Umbagog, and Kennebago lakes all at once. Each lake catches light differently, their surfaces telling different stories about wind and weather. Standing here, you understand how water organizes this landscape, how valleys filled with glacial melt became today's lakes, all draining eventually toward the sea through routes that seem impossibly complex from this height. The overlook sits where a glacier paused in its retreat, dropping its load of debris to create this perfect viewing platform. On clear mornings, when mist rises from the lakes in columns, the view becomes three-dimensional, each lake's elevation revealed by how quickly its mist burns off. The 7 lakes never look the same twice. One might be mirror smooth while another shows whitecaps. One might reflect clouds while another holds only sky. It's a place that makes you understand why humans have always sought heights, not for conquest, but for comprehension, to see how the pieces of landscape fit together. Cryhaven sits 25 miles from the mainland, so far offshore that it exists in a different world, inhabited year-round by exactly 2 people. This is Maine's most remote inhabited island, though inhabited might be generous for a population that could fit in a small car. The island has no store, no school, no services of any kind, just 2 people maintaining a presence on a rock that the Atlantic seems determined to reclaim. In winter, they might go months without seeing another human, dependent on weather windows for supply boats that sometimes never come. The isolation is so complete that the island has developed its own microevolution. Plants grow here slightly different from mainland varieties, shaped by salt wind and isolation into unique forms. The 2 year-round residents are caretakers of absence, maintaining a community that barely exists, keeping the island legally inhabited to preserve its status. Summer brings a few dozen seasonal residents, but by October they flee, leaving the island to wind and waves and 2 humans who've chosen the ultimate social distance. At night, no lights are visible in any direction except stars, and the darkness is so complete it has weight, pressing down like a blanket of nothing. Sugarloaf Mountain hoards winter into July, maintaining snowfields at 4,237 feet in shaded ravines where sun never fully reaches. These aren't glaciers, but something more temporary, yet still persistent. Snow that falls in October and doesn't fully melt until new snow is almost ready to fall again. The snowfields exist in the mountain's north-facing cirques, where granite walls create permanent shadow and cold air pools like invisible lakes. Skiers have been known to make turns here on the 4th of July, earning bragging rights for the latest natural snow skiing in Maine. The snow changes through its long persistence, becoming granular, almost like sand, compressing under its own weight into something denser than what fell from the sky. Plants around these snowfields bloom in August, thinking it's spring, following a calendar offset from the rest of the mountain. The persistence of snow here depends on precise conditions. A few degrees warmer and it would all melt by May. A few degrees cooler and permanent ice might form. It's a margin that climate change threatens, these July snowfields becoming rarer, lasting fewer years. A thermometer made of frozen water that measures something larger than weather. The St. Croix River forms 129 miles of international boundary between Maine and Canada. But the border's most poignant point is Dauchet Island, where French explorers spent the winter of 1604, barely surviving. Nearly half the expedition died on this small island, chose it for defense, but didn't understand how brutal a Maine winter could be. The island sits in the river like a memorial to misunderstanding geography, to the price of not knowing where you are. Today, it's a park, accessible by boat, where you can stand where Samuel de Champlain stood, where men died of scurvy while indigenous peoples on both shores knew how to prevent it. The river here runs both ways with the tide, salt water pushing inland for miles, confusing the French who didn't understand tidal rivers. The international boundary runs down the middle of the river, invisible but legally absolute, splitting the water molecules between nations. Seals cross it without knowing. Eagles fish both sides without papers. The island remains neutral ground, managed jointly, though the French claims have long since transferred through conquest and treaty to become Canadian, while the river keeps flowing, indifferent to the human need to draw lines through water. Chamberlain Lake sprawls across 11,000 acres, but its most remarkable feature is invisible. In 1841, a dam raised the lake 10 feet and reversed its flow, sending water south to Bangor Mills instead of north to the St. Lawrence. This was engineering as geography revision, humans deciding that water was flowing the wrong direction and fixing it. The lake still feels confused, its north end higher than seems natural, its outlet where its inlet should be. The dam turned a north-flowing watershed into a south-flowing one. Logs that would have gone to Quebec went to Massachusetts instead. The economic geography of nations altered by 10 feet of wooden dam. The lake remembers its original direction in subtle ways. Sediment patterns that don't match current flow. Old beaches above the waterline. Tributary streams that enter at odd angles. The reversal was part of the Telos War, a bloodless boundary dispute where Maine and Massachusetts argued over jurisdiction, while lumbermen solved the problem with saws and hammers. Today the lake flows south still, though the mills are gone, the logs no longer run, and few remember that this water once sought a different sea. Mount Maguntacook in the Camden Hills wears a stone tower at its summit, built in 1921, that has developed a 3-degree tilt from frost heaving in the bedrock. The tower was meant to be permanent, a memorial built to last, but the mountain had other ideas. Each winter, water freezes in cracks in the granite, expanding, lifting, slowly pushing the tower off vertical. The tilt is barely visible, but measurable, growing by fractions of degrees each decade. From the tower, you can see Penobscot Bay spread like rumpled silk, islands scattered like seeds. The tower was built to honor a teenager who fell from the cliffs, and now the tower itself is slowly falling, just much more slowly. Engineers have studied stabilizing it, but that would mean fighting the mountain, and mountains generally win such fights. So the tower leans, a little more each year, a monument to mortality that's becoming mortal itself. The view from the tilting tower feels slightly off balance, as if the horizon has shifted, though it's the viewer who has moved. Eventually, physics will win, and the tower will fall, but for now it stands, crooked but stubborn, marking the summit while slowly saying goodbye. The basin on the Phippsburg Peninsula is a tidal pool of extraordinary size, 18 acres that completely empty and fill with each tide through a channel just 10 feet wide. Twice daily, millions of gallons race through this narrow gap, creating reversing rapids that run one direction as the tide rises, the opposite as it falls. At high tide, the basin is a peaceful lake where families swim and kayak. 6 hours later, it's a mudflat where clam diggers work, racing the returning water. The channel at the entrance roars during mid-tide, water moving so fast it creates standing waves. Seals ride the current in and out like an amusement park ride, timing their passages for maximum speed. The basin is a lesson in fluid dynamics, how a small opening can control a large volume, how geography creates schedules that humans must follow. Miss the tide, and you're either trapped inside until the next cycle, or stranded outside. The indigenous peoples used this predictable trap, placing weirs that caught fish as the basin emptied. You can still see the stone foundations at low tide, engineering that worked with nature rather than against it, catching dinner using the moon's pull on water. Crocker Mountain's South Cirque cradles the highest alpine bog in Maine, a wetland at 3,500 feet where water sits on impermeable granite, creating a piece of Arctic that shouldn't exist this far south. The bog supports plants found nowhere else in Maine, Arctic species that rode the glaciers south and stayed when the ice retreated, trapped by altitude. The water here is so acidic from sphagnum moss that it preserves everything. Logs that fell centuries ago look fresh cut. Insects that died decades ago look ready to fly. Walking through the bog requires careful steps on hummocks of moss, between which dark water of unknown depth waits. In winter, the bog freezes solid, becoming part of the mountain, indistinguishable under snow. But in summer, it's a separate world, where carnivorous sundews trap insects, where orchids bloom in colors that seem impossible at this elevation. The bog breathes, expanding when rain fills it, contracting in drought, but never fully drying. It's been here since the ice left, 12,000 years of slow accumulation, building soil grain by grain in a place where soil shouldn't exist. Climate change threatens this aerial wetland, a few degrees warmer, and the Arctic plants have nowhere higher to go. Little Diamond Island in Casco Bay conceals 200,000 square feet of underground bunkers beneath its peaceful surface, the hidden architecture of Fort McKinley. Built during World War I, expanded during World War II, the fort turned this small island into an underground city. The bunkers remain, connected by tunnels that run beneath houses, now worth millions. New residents discover rooms they didn't know existed, doors that open to corridors that seem to go forever. The military left in 1945, but their excavations remain, slowly filling with water in some places, perfectly preserved in others. The island above gives no hint of the island below. Lovely homes, a small beach, views of Portland. But beneath, a different geography exists, one of concrete and steel, of rooms designed for war now storing kayaks and lawnmowers. Some bunkers have been converted to wine cellars, their constant temperature and humidity perfect for aging. Others remain sealed, their contents unknown, their purposes forgotten. The island is really two islands, the one people see and the one they don't. The sunny surface and the dark beneath, connected by staircases that descend from normal life into military memory. The rapid river lives up to its name, plummeting 273 feet in just 3 miles between Lower Richardson Lake and Umbagog, averaging a 91-foot drop per mile. This is Maine's steepest navigable river. Though navigable is generous. Expert kayakers run it. Everyone else walks around. The river is really a 3-mile waterfall broken into steps, each pool between rapids just long enough to catch your breath before the next plunge. The water runs so fast, it stays oxygenated even in summer heat, supporting brook trout in conditions that would kill them elsewhere. The sound is constant, a white roar that becomes meditative, drowning out thought. Logs once ran this river during drives, thousands of them released at once, filling the river bank to bank, more wood than water. You can still see iron rings in rocks where boom chains held logs back, where men with pike poles risked their lives for wages that seem impossible now. The river has cut a gorge through granite, patient water wearing away patient stone, each spring flood taking a few more grains, deepening the channel imperceptibly but inevitably. Schoodic Mountain rises only 1,069 feet, modest by any measure. Yet from its summit, you can see 35 lakes spreading in every direction, more than any other peak under 2,000 feet in Maine. The mountain sits in exactly the right place, a bump in otherwise flat terrain that provides views usually reserved for much higher peaks. Each lake visible from here has a story, some natural, some dammed, some that appear only in spring when snow melts fill depressions. The summit is bare granite, scoured by glaciers, polished by weather, to a surface that reflects light like water. On the clearest days, usually after a cold front passes, you can see Mount Desert Island floating on the horizon like a distant planet. The mountain is a perfect weather predictor. Clouds hit it first, rain reaches it before the valleys, snow dusts it, while lower elevations see rain. Fire tower ruins crown the summit, remnants from when humans watched for smoke, now just concrete footings where ravens perch. The number of lakes visible changes with seasons and rainfall. In drought, some disappear entirely. In wet years, new ones appear where usually there are only meadows. Eastern Egg Rock was silent for a century, its puffin colony destroyed by hunting, until 1973 when biologists began an improbable restoration. They transplanted puffin chicks from Newfoundland, raised them on the island, hoping they would return to breed. The project seemed impossible. Puffins returned to where they were born, and none had been born here in living memory. But using decoys and mirrors, playing puffin calls, scientists convinced young birds that this was a puffin colony. Now, 150 pairs nest on just 7 acres, a triumph of tricking nature into healing itself. The rock is barely an island, more of a granite bump that happens to stay above high tide. In storms, waves wash completely over it, yet the puffins return each spring, their comic faces and clumsy land maneuvers hiding their grace underwater where they fly through liquid as easily as air. The restoration required 24-hour guards to protect the birds from gulls, required people to live in blinds through breeding season, required a dedication that bordered on obsession. But it worked, and now puffins are back, their whirring wings and guttural calls again part of Maine's coastal chorus. The Great Heath near Columbia sprawls across 4,000 acres, the largest peat bog in Maine, a landscape that exists somewhere between land and water, never quite deciding which to be. The bog is actually a raised dome, its center higher than its edges, defying intuition about how water should behave. This dome formed over 8,000 years as sphagnum moss grew, died, and compressed into peat, building the bog upward rather than outward. Walking on it feels like walking on a waterbed made of earth. Each step sends ripples through the surface, trees nearby swaying though there's no wind. The peat here is 30 feet deep in places, a compressed history of post-glacial Maine, each foot representing centuries. Carnivorous pitcher plants grow here, Maine's only native species, their modified leaves forming death traps for insects. The bog has moods that change with rainfall. In wet years, it's impassable. In dry years, you can walk across it, though never without the feeling that you might break through into something ancient and patient below. Core samples from the peat read like history books, showing climate changes, volcanic eruptions from around the world, even pollen from plants that no longer exist. The area around Atene Pond receives 120 inches of snow annually, the highest average in Maine, creating a microclimate that's 20 degrees colder than the coast just 2 hours away. The snow comes from geography, mountains that force moisture-laden air upward where it cools and drops its burden. Snow falls from October through May, sometimes June, creating a 9-month winter that shapes everything. The trees, the animals, the few humans who stay year-round. The snowpack reaches 15 feet in the woods, burying small trees entirely, creating a smooth white surface punctuated by the tops of larger trees. Moose and deer migrate to yards where they pack down trails, creating communities of survival. The cold here isn't just temperature but duration. Streams that elsewhere run all winter freeze solid here. Frost penetrates 6 feet into the ground. Lakes ice over so thick that trucks could drive on them if there were roads, which there aren't. Spring, when it finally comes, happens all at once. A month of melt that turns every depression into a pond, every trail into a stream. Then summer, brief and buggy, before the first September snows remind everyone what's coming. Muscongas Bay fractures the coast into 28 finger-like peninsulas and over 200 islands, creating 500 miles of shoreline within its 10-mile width. The bay is what happens when the sea invades a landscape of parallel ridges, flooding the valleys between, turning ridges into peninsulas and hilltops into islands. Each peninsula has its own character, its own community of people who chose that particular finger of land. The islands range from substantial, Loud's Island with its summer colony, to mere rocks that appear only at low tide. Navigating the bay requires local knowledge, understanding which passages are safe at which tides, which ledges hide just below the surface. From the air, the bay looks like a giant hand pressed into dough, leaving finger marks that filled with water. The complexity creates countless micro-environments, protected coves where tropical-seeming plants grow, exposed points where only the hardiest species survive. Every peninsula thinks it has the best views. Every island believes it's the most special. And perhaps they're all right. With 500 miles of shoreline in such a small area, there's enough variety for every claim to be true. Old Speck Mountain reaches 4,170 feet into Maine sky, the state's third highest peak and the northern terminus of the Mahoosic Range that begins in New Hampshire. The mountain straddles the border, its summit in Maine, but its southern slopes in New Hampshire, a geography that ignores political boundaries. The Appalachian Trail traverses its summit, and hikers arriving from the south have just completed the Mahoosic Range, some of the most challenging terrain on the entire trail. The mountain's name comes from sailors who could see it from the ocean, a speck on the horizon that helped them navigate. From the summit, the view encompasses the Presidential Range, the rest of the Mahoosooks, and on the clearest days, Mount Katahdin, floating like a distant dream. The summit is above treeline, a world of krumholtz and alpine plants where weather can change from benign to dangerous in minutes. An observation tower, built in the era when fire watching was done by humans, still stands, though now it serves only to lift viewers above the stunted trees. The mountain creates its own weather, clouds forming against its bulk, precipitation falling here while valleys stay dry. Shin Pond performs a magic trick of reflection, mirroring Mount Katahdin perfectly from 12 miles away, the furthest mountain reflection documented in New England. The reflection requires perfect conditions, no wind, clear air, and the right angle of light, usually just after dawn. When conditions align, the mountain appears twice, once in reality and once inverted in the pond's surface, creating a symmetry that seems designed. The pond is relatively small, but its position relative to Katahdin is perfect, as if placed specifically for this purpose. Photographers wait days, sometimes weeks, for the perfect reflection, camping at the pond's edge, waking before dawn day after day. The reflection is so clear that people sometimes can't tell which image is real without looking for birds flying through one but not the other. The pond is shallow and weedy, except for a deeper channel that provides the dark water necessary for perfect reflection. Local lore says the pond was sacred to indigenous peoples precisely because of this reflection, a place where the mountain's spirit lived in water. Whether true or not, there's something profound about seeing Maine's greatest mountain doubled, as if one Katahdin wasn't enough for the landscape to express what it needed to say. The Carabasset River has carved a 3-mile gorge through slate bedrock, creating 24 named swimming holes, each with its own temperature profile that can differ by 5 degrees from the others. The river here drops through a series of natural pools, each carved by centuries of spring floods, spinning rocks in eddies until they drill perfect bowls in the bedrock. The names tell stories. Devil's Laundry, where water churns like a washing machine. Elephant's Trunk, where a rock formation channels water in an arc. The Tubs, a series of connected pools like a natural water park. The slate fractures in flat sheets, creating underwater ledges perfect for sitting, natural stairs between levels. Each pool has its own acoustic properties. Some amplify sound, others absorb it, creating pockets of roar and silence. The water temperature varies not just between pools, but within them. Cold springs enter some pools from below, creating shocking thermoclines where warm surface water meets near freezing bottom water. In summer, locals have their favorite pools, some preferring the warmer upper pools, others the colder, deeper, lower ones. The gorge is narrow enough that trees meet overhead in places, creating green tunnels where light filters through leaves onto water that's been running this route since the mountains rose. Mount Katahdin stands as a true monadnock, rising 4,500 feet above the surrounding peneplain, the greatest vertical relief of any mountain east of the Rocky Mountains. This isn't just elevation, but prominence. The mountain rises from near sea level to nearly a mile high in one massive granite statement. The isolation is absolute. No foothills ease the transition from flat to vertical. The mountain simply erupts from the forest floor. This dramatic relief creates its own weather system, its own biogeography, its own gravity that seems to pull everything toward it. Rivers radiate from Katahdin like spokes from a hub, each draining a different face, carrying the mountain grain by grain toward different seas. The indigenous name, Katahdin, means greatest mountain, and from anywhere within 50 miles, it dominates the horizon, impossible to ignore. Clouds form against it even on clear days, created by the mountain forcing air upward into cooler altitudes. The relief is so extreme that climbing Katahdin is like traveling from Georgia to Labrador in 5 miles, passing through every ecosystem between. Standing at its base looking up induces vertigo, the mountain seeming to lean forward, about to topple. From its summit looking down, the earth curves away in every direction, and you understand why this mountain stands alone. There's simply no room in the landscape for anything else of such magnitude. And so we've wandered through Maine's quiet geography tonight, from islands counted like calendar days to mountains that catch tomorrow's first light. We've traced rivers that flow backward and forwards, felt the weight of granite cliffs and the patience of ancient stones. Maine reveals itself not in grand gestures, but in accumulations of islands, of tides, of moments when ice and time conspired to carve something remarkable from the ordinary earth. These 100 facts are really 100,000 stories, written in bedrock and bog, in summit and shore. Each cove and mountain, each lake and ledge holds more than we've spoken tonight. We've seen floating forests that drift with the wind, caves that breathe winter into summer, tides that could swallow cities twice daily. We've stood on granite that remembers the equator, walked shores that retreat 6 inches each year, discovered deserts where there should be forest, and forests where there should be only stone. Geography never sleeps, it only waits, patient as stone, persistent as tide, for someone to notice its quiet wonders. The mountains we've climbed tonight will outlive the names we've given them. The rivers we've followed will continue their patient carving long after our languages are forgotten. Even now, as you drift towards sleep, Maine continues its slow transformations, sand moving grain by grain, rocks splitting in freeze and thaw, islands emerging and disappearing with tides that never rest. What we call Maine is really a moment in a longer story, a paragraph in a book the earth is still writing. The glaciers that carved these lakes will return someday, or the seas will rise to claim the coast, or the mountains will wear down to nothing. But tonight, in this moment, the geography exists perfect and patient, every pond reflecting stars, every mountain standing sentinel, every island held in the embrace of the sea. May these fragments of Maine's landscape drift with you now into sleep, where islands float free and mountains dissolve into dreams. Perhaps in your sleep, you'll walk the knife edge without fear, swim in alpine pools that never freeze, find those towns beneath Flagstaff Lake still going about their drowned business. Let the rhythm of tides and the patience of stone carry you into that geography of dreams, where all waters flow the direction they choose, and all mountains float at exactly the height they prefer. Thank you for joining me tonight in the darkness, for wandering through this atlas of wonders that exist whether we notice them or not. Tomorrow, Maine will still be there, adding another day's accumulation to its long history, another tide's worth of erosion, another season's collection of sediment, another ring in the trees that grow from cracks in granite. But that's tomorrow's geography. Tonight, let these 100 windows into Maine's quiet mysteries close one by one as you settle into sleep. This has been Midnight Geography. Sleep well and dream of patient stones and faithful tides.